28 years ago, he walked away from the woman he loved, chasing fame and fortune, unaware of a secret buried deep beneath the dust of time. Now, as the dazzling lights of the elite world shine down, he uncovers something money and power can't buy. But is it too late to make things right? Hit that like button and subscribe to dive into this emotional journey of honor, sacrifice, and the search for light in the shadows. The Manhattan skyline glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ethan Caldwell's penthouse, a constellation of cold lights that mirrored the emptiness within. At 60, Ethan was a man sculpted by discipline, sharp cheekbones framed, a face hardened by decades of ruthless decisions, his gray eyes reflecting the steel of his will. The penthouse, perched atop one of New York's most exclusive towers, was a monument to his success. Sleek marble floors, ebony furniture polished to a mirror sheen, and a chandelier dripping crystals that caught the city's glow. Yet, as he sat alone at the edge of a long glass table, the silence was deafening, broken only by the faint tapping of his fingers on the laptop he'd carried from the office. Caldwell Enterprises, his financial empire, thrived under his iron grip. But tonight, the victory felt hollow. In his left hand, he held a single relic of a softer past, a tarnished silver pen, its surface scratched from years of use. Margaret had given it to him 28 years ago, her hazel eyes bright with hope as she pressed it into his palm. "For the man who'll write his own story," she'd said, her voice warm like the summer dusk they'd shared. But Ethan had chosen a different story, one dictated by his father, Charles Caldwell, a titan of industry who saw love as a distraction. "You're meant for more than a small-town girl," Charles had sneered, and Ethan, young and ambitious, had believed him. He left Margaret without a goodbye, burying her memory beneath boardroom battles and billion-dollar deals. The pen was all that remained, a quiet accusation he couldn't discard. Tonight, after a grueling day negotiating with a rival firm, Ethan needed an escape, not from the work, but from the cameras that stalked him outside Caldwell Enterprises. The paparazzi were relentless, their flashes a constant reminder of the price he paid for power. He slipped into his black overcoat, left the penthouse, and drove to a small coffee shop on the edge of Midtown, a place too ordinary for anyone to look for him. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, the scent of roasted beans and burnt toast cutting through the sterile air of his usual world. He ordered a black coffee and settled into a corner booth, the chipped wooden table a stark contrast to the polished surfaces he ruled. Then he heard it, a soft, broken sob from the booth behind him. Ethan turned slightly, his gaze landing on a young woman, no older than 27, her shoulders hunched as if the world had pressed too hard. Her dark hair fell in messy strands over a worn jacket, and her hands clutched a cold coffee mug, like a lifeline. Tears streaked her pale cheeks, but her jaw was set, a quiet defiance in her grief. The other patrons ignored her, lost in their own lives, but Ethan couldn't look away. Something about her, those eyes wide and wounded yet unyielding, stirred a memory he'd long suppressed. Margaret's eyes had looked like that once, the night he'd walked away. He hesitated, his instinct to remain detached warring with a flicker of something softer. Ethan Caldwell didn't do compassion. It was a weakness he'd purged years ago. But the sound of her crying, raw and unguarded, gnawed at him. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing the crisp linen of his handkerchief embossed with the subtle CE of his company. Standing, he approached her table, his polished shoes silent on the linoleum floor. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and steady, though it carried an unfamiliar tremor. He set the handkerchief on the table, a small gesture that felt like a crack in his armor. The woman looked up, startled, her hazel eyes locking with his. For a moment, Ethan's breath caught. Those eyes were too familiar, too much like Margaret's. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her jacket, then took the handkerchief with a shaky hand. I just lost everything," she said, her voice a whisper frayed by exhaustion. "I don't know what to do." Ethan pulled out the chair across from her and sat, a decision he didn't fully understand. "I'm Ethan," he said, keeping his tone even, though his pulse quickened. "What happened?" Her name was Lily, she told him, and the words spilled out like a dam breaking. Her mother was dying. Cancer, she said, her voice cracking on the word. And the medical bills had drained her savings. She'd lost her job that morning, a low-paying gig at a bookstore, and now she faced eviction. "I've got no one left," she finished, staring into the cold coffee as if it held answers. Ethan listened, his face a mask of calm, but inside, a storm brewed. Her story wasn't his to fix, he owed her nothing. Yet her resilience, the way she held herself together despite the weight, struck a chord he couldn't ignore. "Why are you here?" she asked suddenly, her gaze sharpening with a hint of suspicion. "You don't look like you belong in a place like this." Ethan leaned back, considering her. The truth, that he was hiding from the world he'd built, felt too raw to admit. Instead, he said, "I've seen people alone before. I didn't help then. Maybe I can now." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Lily's lips twitched, a faint smile breaking through her tears. "You're strange," she said, but there was no malice in it. As she dabbed her eyes with his handkerchief, Ethan noticed the CE embroidered in gold thread. It gleamed under the dim lights, a symbol of the empire he'd traded his soul for. He stood to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Thank you," she said, simple and sincere. He nodded, a tightness in his chest he couldn't name. Driving back. To the penthouse, the city lights blurred past, but all he saw was Lily's face, those eyes that echoed Margaret's. Alone in his glass tower, Ethan gripped the silver pen, its weight heavier than ever. For the first time in years, he wondered if the story he'd written could still be rewritten. The coffee shop's dim glow felt like a sanctuary as Ethan Caldwell sat across from Lily. The chipped table between them, a fragile bridge. The air carried the faint sweetness of waffles baking in the back, a scent that tugged at a memory he'd buried deep. Margaret standing in her tiny kitchen, flipping waffles on a Sunday morning, her laughter filling the room. Ethan pushed the thought aside, focusing on the young woman before him. Lily's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the cold mug, her hazel eyes, too much like Margaret's, darting between exhaustion and defiance. She'd stopped crying, but the weight of her words lingered, heavy as the silence that followed. "I don't usually spill my life to strangers," she said, her voice steadier now, laced with a self-respect that reminded Ethan of someone he'd once known. "But you asked." He nodded, keeping his expression composed, though his mind raced. Last night, in the sterile quiet of his penthouse, he'd replayed her story, her dying mother, the lost job, the looming eviction, and felt an unfamiliar pull. Ethan Caldwell didn't meddle in others' lives. He built empires, not bridges. Yet here he was, drawn to this stranger whose pain echoed a regret he'd never faced. "Tell me about your mother," he said, his tone measured, a businessman seeking facts rather than feelings. Lily's lips tightened, then softened as she spoke. "Her name's Margaret. She was everything to me. Strong, even when life wasn't kind. She raised me alone, worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices, sewing at night. She always said, my father was a man too busy for us, someone who chose his career over family." Her words landed like a quiet blow, each one chiseling at the wall Ethan had built around his past. Margaret. The name wasn't rare, but paired with that description, it felt like a ghost stepping into the light. He kept his face still, years of boardroom discipline masking the storm within. 28 years ago, he'd left Margaret without a word, her pleas drowned out by his father's voice. "She'll hold you back, Ethan. Cut her loose." He'd done it, convinced ambition was worth more than love. Now, as Lily spoke, the pieces hovered, too close to fit, too sharp to ignore. "What did she say about him?" he asked, his voice low, probing without betraying the tremor in his chest. Lily shrugged, a bitter edge creeping in. "Not much. Just that he was someone important, someone who didn't look back. She never hated him, though. Said he gave her me and that was enough." She paused, then added, "I used to wonder what kind of man does that. Walks away and never wonders what he left behind." Ethan's fingers tightened around his coffee cup, the porcelain cool against his skin. He wanted to argue, to defend the man he'd been. but the truth stung. He hadn't wondered. Not until now. The conversation shifted as Lily recounted her struggles, the hospital bills piling up, the landlord's eviction notice taped to her door that morning. Ethan listened, his mind split between her story and the shadow of Margaret looming larger, with every word. He couldn't fix her life, not without crossing a line he'd drawn long ago, but inaction felt like cowardice, a trait he despised. "You need a job," he said finally, the words clipped, decisive. "I can offer you one at Caldwell Enterprises. Assistant work, nothing glamorous, but it pays." It was a practical move, he told himself, a way to help without getting tangled in her world. Lily's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering. "Why? You don't know me." Ethan met her gaze, steady and unyielding. "I see potential in you," he said, the lie smooth on his tongue. "You're tough. I respect that. Take it or leave it." It wasn't pity. He wouldn't insult her with that, but a chance to quiet the guilt gnawing at him. She studied him, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but I'm not a charity case." Her pride mirrored his own, and for a moment he almost smiled. As she reached for her bag to leave, it tipped over, spilling its meager contents onto the table. A few crumpled bills, a key, and a small photograph. Ethan's breath caught as he saw it. Margaret younger, her hair tied back, holding a toddler with Lily's same wide eyes. The image hit him like a fist, the years peeling away to reveal the woman he'd loved and lost. His hand moved instinctively to pick it up, but he stopped, fingers hovering. Lily snatched it back, her voice sharp. "That's private." Ethan nodded, forcing calm into his posture, though his pulse hammered. "She's beautiful," he said, the words slipping out before he could catch them. Lily softened, tucking the photo away. She was, still is, even now. She stood, clutching the handkerchief he'd given her. "I'll see you tomorrow, then. Caldwell Enterprises, right?" Ethan confirmed with a curt nod, watching her walk out into the night, her silhouette, swallowed by the city's hum. Alone again, he stared at the empty booth, the photograph burned into his mind. Margaret, Lily. The connection was too stark, too real. Was it possible? He'd left Margaret 28 years ago, Lily was 27. The math aligned, but he needed proof, not speculation. Back in his penthouse, Ethan pulled the silver pen from his pocket, its weight a tether to the past. He crossed to a locked drawer in his desk, one he hadn't opened in years, and retrieved a stack of unopened letters, Margaret's handwriting on the envelopes faded but unmistakable. He'd kept them, unable to read them then, unwilling to throw them away. Now, with Lily's face haunting him, he sliced one open, his hand steady despite the tremor in his soul. "Ethan," it began. "I'm pregnant. I need you." The date, 28 years ago, confirmed what his heart already feared. Lily was his daughter. He set the letter down, his breathing even, his face a mask of control. Ethan Caldwell didn't crumble. He didn't rage. But in the cold glow of his penthouse, under lights that couldn't warm, he felt the first crack in the armor of his dignity, a crack that promised either ruin or redemption. Ethan Caldwell stood alone in his office at Caldwell Enterprises, the city's skyline sprawling beyond the glass wall like a kingdom he'd conquered. The room was a fortress of power, polished mahogany desk, leather chair, shelves lined with awards glinting under recessed lights. Yet, as dawn bled into the Manhattan morning, the space felt less like a throne and more like a cage. The letter from Margaret lay open before him, its faded ink a silent scream from 28 years ago. "Ethan, I'm pregnant. I need you." He'd read it a dozen times since last night, each word carving deeper into the armor of his self-respect. Lily, her face, her voice, her unbreakable spirit, was his daughter. The truth was no longer a question, but a weight he couldn't shed. He'd locked the other letters away again, unopened, their presence a Pandora's box he wasn't ready to face. Ethan didn't crumble under pressure. He thrived on it. Decades of outmaneuvering rivals, silencing doubters, and building an empire had honed his discipline into a blade. But this was no negotiation, no deal to close. This was a reckoning, and for the first time, he felt the edges of his control fraying. He straightened, smoothing his tie, and turned to the window. The city didn't care about his past, and neither could he. Not yet. Lily would arrive soon, her first day as his assistant, and he'd vowed to keep his composure. She deserved that much. The elevator chimed, and Lily stepped into the office, her worn jacket replaced by a simple blazer that hung slightly too large on her frame. She carried a small wooden box, its edges scuffed, and set it on the desk with a quiet thud. "Morning," she said, her voice steady but tinged with nerves. "I brought something. My mom's stuff. Thought it might help me feel grounded here." Ethan nodded, his expression a mask of calm professionalism. "Good instinct," he replied, gesturing to a chair. "Let's get you started." He handed her a stack of files, routine tasks to ease her in. But his eyes lingered on the box, a relic that promised answers he both craved and feared. As Lily sorted papers, she opened the box, revealing a jumble of keepsakes, a faded scarf, a few trinkets, and a bundle of letters tied with twine. "She kept everything," Lily said, a faint smile breaking through. Said it reminded her of who she was. Ethan's pulse quickened, but he kept his hands clasped, his posture rigid. "Mind if I look?" he asked, his tone casual, though his throat tightened. Lily shrugged, sliding the box toward him. "Sure, it's mostly junk anyway." He untied the twine, lifting a letter from the top. The handwriting was Margaret's, unmistakable even after all these years. He unfolded it, his movements deliberate, and read silently. "Dear Ethan, I named her Lily because she's my light. You'll never know her, and maybe that's for the best. But she's yours too, whether you want her or not." The date matched. 27 years ago, just after Lily's birth. Ethan's chest constricted, but his face remained a stone wall. Margaret had known he'd never come back, yet she'd carried this secret alone, shielding their daughter from his world. He set the letter down, his fingers steady, though a storm raged inside. Lily was his flesh and blood, a truth etched in, ink and time. Lily glanced up, catching his silence. "Something wrong?" she asked, her brow furrowing. Ethan met her gaze, those hazel eyes piercing him like Margaret's once had. "No," he said, his voice smooth as glass. "Just, your mother had a way with words." Lily chuckled, a sound that cut through his defenses. "Yeah, she did. Always said my dad didn't care enough to stick around. Guess that's why. I don't trust handouts. I've got her pride in me." The irony stung, but Ethan didn't flinch. "Pride's a good thing," he replied, "as long as it doesn't blind you." He pushed the box back, his mind racing. Lily didn't know. Couldn't. No, not yet. Telling her now would shatter her trust, maybe her life, and Ethan refused to wield that power carelessly. He'd abandoned Margaret once. He wouldn't abandon their daughter again, not even with the truth. But keeping it hidden felt like a betrayal of his own dignity, a lie he'd sworn never to live. He stood, crossing to the window, his back to her as he wrestled the conflict. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent to his turmoil. Inside, he was a man split, between the father he'd failed to be and the man he'd forged through control. "Mr. Caldwell?" Lily's voice pulled him back. She held a photo from the box. Margaret, younger, smiling beside a toddler Lily, her tiny hand clutching a daisy. "This is us," she said, her tone soft. She was so happy then. Ethan turned, forcing a odd. "She looks it," he said, his voice betraying nothing, though his throat burned. The image was a mirror to his regret, Margaret's joy, built without him, and Lily, a daughter he'd never held. "You've got her strength," he added, the words slipping out raw and unguarded. Lily smiled, tucking the photo away. "Thanks. I try." She returned to the files, oblivious to the earthquake she'd unleashed in him. Ethan sat again, his hands folded, his breathing even. He'd spent a lifetime mastering himself, every glance, every word calculated. But this was a test unlike any other. Lily was his daughter, a living piece of the love he'd discarded, and he couldn't undo the past. But he could protect her now, give her a chance he'd denied Margaret. That was his responsibility, his dignity redefined, not in boardrooms or bank accounts, but in the quiet resolve to be more than the man who'd walked away. As the morning wore on, Ethan watched Lily work, her focus a mirror of his own discipline. The letters sat untouched, their secrets safe for now. He wouldn't tell her, not until he understood what it meant, not until he could offer more than regret. Outside, the city roared on, but in this office, beneath the dust of decades, Ethan felt the stirrings of something new. A purpose that might one day warm the cold lights he'd lived under all his life. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel shimmered under a sea of chandeliers, their light bouncing off champagne flutes and tailored suits. Ethan Caldwell stood at the edge of the crowd, a solitary figure amid the swirl of New York's elite. The annual Caldwell Enterprises Gala was a showcase of his power. Executives, investors, and socialites mingled, their laughter a polished veneer over the cutthroat world he ruled. Tonight, though, the air felt heavier, the whispers sharper. Ethan adjusted, his cufflinks, his gray eyes scanning the room with the precision of a predator. He'd built this empire with discipline, not charm, and he wore his authority like armor, impenetrable, unyielding. Lily stood a few paces away, her borrowed black dress a touch too formal for her usual simplicity. It was her first week at Caldwell Enterprises, and Ethan had insisted she attend, not as an assistant but as a guest. "You need to see this world," he'd told her, his tone firm but not unkind. She'd hesitated, then agreed, her hazel eyes flickering with curiosity. Now, she clutched a glass of water, her posture stiff as she watched the crowd. Ethan caught her gaze and offered a slight nod, a silent reassurance. She returned it with a small smile, unaware of the storm brewing beyond the gilded walls. 3. First sign came with a flash, a camera snapping from the balcony, its lens aimed at them. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. The press had always circled him, vultures waiting for a crack in his facade, but tonight felt different. Minutes later, Victor Grayson emerged from the throng, his smirk as polished as his tuxedo. At 55, Victor was a rival who'd never forgiven Ethan for outbidding him on a merger 2 decades ago. A loss that cost Victor his father's approval and a chunk of his pride. "Ethan," Victor drawled, his voice dripping with mock warmth. "Nice to see you playing mentor. Who's the girl?" Ethan's expression remained stone cold, his voice a blade of ice. "Her name's Lily. She works for me. That's all. You need to know." Victor chuckled, swirling his drink. "Oh, I think there's more to it. Word's out. Someone dug up an old photo. You and a woman, late 90s. Looks a lot like her mother, doesn't it?" He tilted his head toward Lily, who stood chatting with a guest, oblivious. Ethan's pulse spiked, but he kept his hand steady, clasped behind his back. Victor was fishing, testing him, and Ethan wouldn't bite. Not here. Not now. The photo. He'd known it existed. Margaret had loved her Polaroids, capturing moments he'd dismissed as trivial. One must have survived, unearthed by some enterprising reporter or Victor's own spite. Ethan's mind raced, piecing it together. The timing, Lily's age, the resemblance. The press would spin it into scandal. Ethan Caldwell, the untouchable titan, hiding a secret child. He could already see the headlines, the whispers rippling through this room. But worse was the thought of Lily caught in the crossfire. Her life, dissected for sport. Victor leaned closer, his voice a venomous whisper. "What's she to you, Ethan? A mistake you buried? Or a pawn for your image?" The words were a deliberate jab, meant to provoke, to unravel the control Ethan wore like a second skin. He felt the heat rise in his chest, the old instinct to crush an enemy. But he didn't. He met Victor's gaze, his eyes hard as granite. "She's someone I'll protect," he said, each word deliberate, "and that's more than you'll ever understand." Victor's smirk faltered, just for a second before he recovered. "We'll see," he said, then drifted back into the crowd, leaving a trail of menace. Ethan turned away, his breathing even, his face a mask. He wouldn't give Victor the satisfaction of a reaction. Anger was weakness, and Ethan Caldwell didn't bend, but the threat was real. By morning, the photo would hit the tabloids and Lily's quiet life would be collateral damage. He crossed to her, his stride calm despite the chaos in his mind. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked, keeping his tone light. She shrugged, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "It's a lot. Everyone's so shiny. I feel like I'm crashing. A party I wasn't invited to." Ethan almost smiled. "You were invited. By me." Before she could reply, his phone buzzed. A text from his PR head. "Photos out. Press is running with it, meeting tomorrow." Ethan slipped the phone back into his pocket, his expression unchanged. Lily didn't need to know. Not yet. But the board would. They'd demand answers, push him to spin the narrative. Use Lily to bolster his image or distance himself entirely. Neither option sat right. She wasn't a tool or a liability. She was his daughter, a truth he'd only just begun to grasp. "Mr. Caldwell?" A board member approached, his voice low. "We need to talk. The rumors—" Ethan cut him off with a raised hand. "Tomorrow," he said, his tone final. The man nodded and retreated, but the message was clear. The pressure was mounting. Ethan glanced at Lily, now laughing softly at something a guest said. Her strength, Margaret's strength, shone through, a quiet dignity that humbled him. He'd failed her mother, left her to face the world alone. He wouldn't fail Lily, too. As the gala wound down, Ethan stood on the balcony, the city's lights a cold constellation below. Victor's taunt echoed, "A mistake you buried." He hadn't buried Margaret. He'd run from her, from the life they could have had. Now, with Lily under his roof, the past was clawing its way back, and the press would feast on it. Ethan gripped the railing, his knuckles white, but his face remained still. He wouldn't lash out, wouldn't let Victor or the board see him crack. Dignity wasn't in the fight. It was in the choice to stand firm, to shield Lily from the storm he'd sown. Back inside, Lily caught his eye, raising her glass in a mock toast. "To surviving the shiny people," she called. Ethan nodded, a faint warmth breaking through his resolve. She didn't know the battle ahead, but he did. And for her, he'd face it, not with fists or fury, but with the quiet strength he'd spent a lifetime forging. Ethan Caldwell drove through the gray dawn, the city's hum fading as he left Manhattan behind. The tabloids had erupted overnight, their headlines screaming across newsstands. Caldwell's secret daughter. The photo, a grainy shot of him and Margaret, young and unguarded, stared back from every screen, paired with speculation about Lily. His phone buzzed relentlessly. Board members, PR, even Victor Grayson's smug "told you so," but Ethan silenced it, his grip tight on the wheel. He wasn't running from the storm. He was chasing the truth. The letters in his desk, Margaret's pleas he'd never answered, gnawed at him. Lily was his daughter. He knew that now. But why had Margaret never fought harder to reach him? His destination was a modest brownstone in Queens, a world away from his glass tower. Margaret lived here now, Lily had said, her voice trembling as she described her mother's fading strength. Ethan hadn't told Lily he was coming. She'd left the office late last night, exhaustion etched into her face after the gala's fallout hit the news. He couldn't burden her with this. Not yet. The street was quiet, lined with sagging porches and leafless trees, a stark contrast to the polished excess of his life. He parked, stepped out, and approached the door, his polished shoes clicking on cracked pavement. Dignity demanded he face this alone. A neighbor answered his knock, an older woman with gray curls and a wary squint. "You're that guy from the papers," she said, crossing her arms. Ethan nodded, his voice steady despite the knot in his chest. "I need to know about Margaret, please." She studied him, then sighed. "She's inside, but she's weak. Cancer's got her bad. Don't upset her." Ethan followed her in, the house small and worn, its air thick with the scent of antiseptic and old wood. Margaret lay on a couch in the living room, a blanket draped over her frail frame, her once vibrant hair now thin and silver. Her hazel eyes, Lily's eyes, met his, widening with recognition. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. He knelt beside her, his movements slow, deliberate, as if suddenness might break her. "Margaret," he said, his tone soft but firm. "I didn't know. About Lily. About any of it." Her lips trembled, a faint smile flickering. "I tried to tell you. You never came." The words pierced him, but he didn't flinch. He'd spent decades mastering control, every emotion locked behind a wall of resolve, and he wouldn't crumble now. "I got your letters," he said, "but too late. Why didn't you keep trying?" She coughed, a rasping sound that made him wince inwardly, though his face stayed still. "I did," she said, her gaze drifting to a faded photo on the table, her and Lily, the same one from the box. "I wrote. I called. Your father. He stopped me." Ethan's breath caught, but he held it, his hands clasped tight. "Charles?" he asked, the name a stone in his throat. Margaret nodded, her eyes clouding with memory. "He came to me, right after Lily was born, said you'd moved on, that you didn't want us. Gave me money to disappear, $10,000. Said it was for your future, your name." The revelation hit like a quiet explosion, shattering the narrative Ethan had clung to for decades. Charles Caldwell, the man who'd shaped him with iron rules and cold ambition, hadn't just pushed him to leave Margaret. He'd erased her, buried their daughter's existence to protect the Caldwell legacy. Ethan's mind reeled, replaying every lecture about duty, every sneer at weakness. "You're meant for more," Charles had said, and Ethan had believed it, abandoning love for power. But this was betrayal, a manipulation so deep it rewrote his past. His hands clenched, knuckles whitening, but his voice stayed level. "He never told me." Margaret's eyes softened, a flicker of pity cutting through her pain. "I figured that later. You were cold, Ethan, but not cruel. I wanted to hate you, but I couldn't. Not when Lily came. She's got your strength, you know." Ethan looked away, the weight of her words pressing against his ribs. He'd built his life on self-respect, on the belief that his choices were his own. Now he saw the lie. Charles had orchestrated it all, and Ethan had been a pawn in his own story. "Why didn't you fight him?" he asked, not accusing, but needing to understand. Margaret sighed, a sound of weary resolve. "I was young, scared. He was powerful. Said he'd ruin me if I didn't go. I took the money for Lily, food, a roof. I didn't want her growing up with nothing because of me." Her honesty stung, a mirror to his own failures. She'd chosen dignity over despair, protecting their daughter while he'd chased a hollow crown. Ethan stood, pacing to the window, his back to her as he wrestled the fury threatening to break free. He wouldn't let it, not in front of her, not when she'd borne so much alone. "I'm sorry," he said finally, turning to face her, his voice a quiet steel. "I didn't know, but I should have. I'll make it right. For Lily. For you." Margaret shook her head weakly. "It's too late for me. Just be there for her now. She's worth it." Her eyes closed, exhaustion claiming her, and Ethan stood silent, the room's stillness wrapping around him like a shroud. Charles was dead, 10 years gone, but his shadow lingered, a ghost Ethan couldn't fight. Yet he could choose now, reclaim the dignity his father had stolen. Outside he leaned against his car, the cold air biting his face. The press would spin their lies, Victor would gloat, but none of it mattered. Lily was his daughter, Margaret's gift and his failure, and he'd shield her, not with anger or vengeance, but with the quiet strength he'd forged through a lifetime of control. The truth had turned his world upside down, but it also lit a path forward, a chance to rewrite the man he'd become, not for power, but for the family he'd lost. Ethan Caldwell sat alone in a small Italian restaurant on the Lower East Side, the kind of place where the hum of conversation, and the clink of plates drowned out the chaos of his world. The table was set for two, a flickering candle casting shadows across the checkered cloth. Outside, Manhattan churned. Tabloids blared his name. Victor Grayson's taunts fueled the gossip, and the board at Caldwell Enterprises demanded answers about the secret daughter scandal. But here, in this pocket of stillness, Ethan waited. For Lily. He'd asked her to meet him after work, his voice calm over the phone despite the tremor in his chest. Tonight he'd tell her the truth. Not because the press forced his hand, but because she deserved it. Because dignity demanded. The door swung open and Lily stepped in, her borrowed blazer swapped for a worn sweater that hung loose on her frame. Her hazel eyes, Margaret's eyes, scanned the room, landing on him with a mix of curiosity and fatigue. She'd spent the day dodging reporters outside the office, her quiet strength holding firm even as the world pried into her life. "This place is a hike from Midtown," she said, sliding into the chair across from him, a faint smile softening her words. "What's the occasion?" Ethan returned the smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I needed somewhere quiet," he said, his tone steady, a shield against the storm inside. They ordered, pasta for her, a glass of red wine for him, and the small talk flowed, a fragile thread between them. Lily spoke of her mother's latest hospital visit, her voice catching as she described Margaret's frail hands clutching hers. Ethan listened, his face composed, though each word tightened the knot in his gut. He'd seen Margaret yesterday, her confession about Charles still echoing. His father's money, his threats, the life she'd built alone. Lily was his daughter, a truth he'd carried for days, and tonight, he'd lay it bare. Not with fanfare or fury, but with the quiet resolve he'd honed over decades. The food arrived, but Ethan barely touched his wine. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table, and took a breath. "Lily," he began, his voice low, deliberate. "There's something I need to tell you." She paused, fork hovering, her brow furrowing. "Okay," she said, setting it down, her gaze locking with his. "What is it?" He held her eyes, the weight of 28 years pressing against his ribs, but he didn't waver. "I'm your father," he said, the words plain, unadorned, a truth stripped of pretense. Lily froze, her breath catching, her face a canvas of shock and disbelief. "What?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Ethan didn't rush to fill the silence. He let it sit, giving her space to process. "I didn't know," he continued, his tone even, though his throat burned. "Not until recently. Your mother, Margaret, tried to tell me when she was pregnant. My father stopped her. He paid her to leave, kept it from me. I found out too late, through her letters, through you." Each sentence was measured, a lifeline he offered without forcing her to take it. Her eyes widened, then narrowed, a storm brewing behind them. "You're saying, you're my dad, and you didn't know?" Her voice rose, sharp with hurt, but she didn't shout. Ethan nodded, his hands still, his posture rigid. "I left her before she could tell me. I chose my career, my father's vision, over her. I didn't know about you until that photo, those letters, until I saw you." Lily pushed back from the table, her chair scraping the floor, her hands trembling. "So what? You're here now because the papers got it right, because it's convenient?" "No," he said, firm but gentle, meeting her accusation head on. "I'm here because it's right, because you're my daughter, and I owe you the truth, whether you want me in your life or not." She stood, pacing a step, then turned back, her eyes blazing. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? You've known for days, weeks maybe, and you let me sit there working for you like some stranger?" The pain in her voice cut deeper than any boardroom betrayal, but Ethan didn't flinch. "I wanted to protect you," he said. "From the press, from me. I didn't want to hurt you more than I already have." Lily laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "Protect me? You don't even know me. You weren't there when Mom worked herself sick, when we scraped by on nothing. You don't get to play hero now. She grabbed her bag, heading for the door, but Ethan rose, his voice cutting through the din. Lily, wait. She stopped, her back to him, her shoulders tense. He didn't chase her, didn't force her to stay. Instead, he pulled a folded letter from his pocket, one of Margaret's, and set it on the table. I wrote this for you, he said, his tone quiet, steady. Read it when you're ready. I'll wait. However long it takes. I'm not walking away again. She hesitated, then turned, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You don't get to decide what I feel, she said, her voice raw but controlled, a mirror to his own restraint. She took the letter, clutching it like a lifeline, and left without another word. The door swung shut behind her, leaving Ethan, alone with the candle's dying flame. He sat again, his hands folded, his breathing even. The urge to follow her, to beg, to explain, surged, but he crushed it. Dignity wasn't in forcing her acceptance. It was in giving her the choice, the respect he'd denied Margaret. The letter he'd written was simple. Lily, I failed you before I knew you existed. I can't undo that. But I can be here now. Not as a savior, but as a father if you'll let me. I'll wait, no matter what you decide. You're worth it. He'd signed it with his name, no title, no empire, just Ethan. Outside, the city buzzed, the press circling. But here, in this quiet defeat, he felt a shift. He'd faced her, faced himself, not with anger or pride, but with the strength to let go. For the first time, the cold lights of his life flickered with the promise of warmth, if only she'd turn back. The grand hall of Caldwell Enterprises buzzed with anticipation, its towering windows framing a Manhattan night ablaze with lights. The annual shareholders' meeting was more than a routine event tonight. It was a battlefield. Ethan Caldwell stood at the podium, his tailored suit a dark silhouette against the spotlight, his gray eyes fixed on the sea of faces. Board members, investors, reporters, all waiting for blood. The scandal had metastasized since Lily stormed out of the restaurant 3 nights ago. Tabloids now screamed Caldwell's bastard exposed, and Victor Grayson had fanned the flames, leaking more photos, and whispers of Ethan's hidden shame. The board had demanded a reckoning, and Ethan had given them one. This moment. He adjusted the microphone, his movements precise, his face a mask of calm forged over decades. Inside, his chest tightened. Lily's rejection still burned, her silence since she'd taken his letter a void he couldn't fill. He'd seen Margaret yesterday, her frail form barely stirring as she whispered, "She'll come around, Ethan. Give her time." Time was a luxury he didn't have, not with Victor in the wings and the company teetering on the edge of chaos. But Ethan hadn't called this meeting to save his empire. He'd called it for her, for Lily, for the daughter he'd failed before he'd known she existed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, cutting through the murmur, like a blade. "You've read the headlines. You've seen the pictures. I'm here to set the record straight." The room hushed, cameras flashing, but Ethan didn't blink. He'd faced worse, hostile takeovers, market crashes, and he'd never flinched. This was different, personal, but he wouldn't break. 28 years ago, I walked away from a woman I loved, Margaret Ellis. I didn't know she was pregnant. I didn't know I had a daughter until 2 weeks ago. Her name is Lily, and she's no secret, no shame, she's my child. A ripple of gasps spread through the crowd, but Ethan pressed on, his tone unwavering. My father, Charles Caldwell, kept her from me. He paid Margaret to disappear, to protect the family name. I found out too late, through letters I never opened, through a life I never lived. That's on me. He paused, letting the weight settle, his hands clasped behind him to hide the faint tremble. Victor Grayson stood near the front, his smirk a taunt, but Ethan ignored it. Anger was a trap. He'd mastered that lesson long ago. The board chairman, Harold Vance, rose, his voice sharp. "Ethan, this is a disgrace. You've jeopardized our reputation. We need a strategy. Spin this. Distance yourself." Murmurs of agreement followed, but Ethan raised a hand, silencing them. No spin, he said, his gaze sweeping the room. No distance. Lily's not a liability to manage. She's my daughter, and I won't let her be fodder for your headlines or your profits. The words landed like a quiet thunderclap, and Victor stepped forward, his voice loud, mocking. Noble, Ethan, but naive. You think this saves you? The board's done with you. Your little sob story won't change that. Ethan met Victor's eyes, his expression granite. I'm not here to save myself, he said, each word deliberate. I'm here to end this. He turned back to the podium, his voice rising just enough to command the room. Effective immediately, I resign as CEO of Caldwell Enterprises. I've led this company for 30 years, built it from nothing, but I won't lead it at her expense. You want a clean slate? You've got it. The hall erupted, shouts, gasps, cameras snapping. But Ethan stood still, his breathing even, his dignity intact. Victor laughed, a harsh bark. You're throwing it all away for a girl you barely know? Pathetic. Ethan didn't respond, didn't need to. Victor's bait was predictable, a child's tantrum against a man who'd learned restraint. Harold stammered. Ethan, reconsider. This is rash. But Ethan cut him off. It's done, he said, final, unyielding. He stepped back, the spotlight dimming as he moved to the edge of the stage, the crowd's chaos a distant roar. He'd given them his empire, a sacrifice not of weakness, but of strength, a choice to reclaim the honor Charles had stolen. Then he saw her. Lily stood at the back, near the doors, her sweater stark against the sea of suits. Her eyes, wide, glistening, locked with his, her hands clutching the letter he'd written. She'd come. Ethan froze, his heart lurching, but he didn't rush to her. He waited, his posture steady, giving her the space she'd demanded. She moved forward, weaving through the crowd, her steps hesitant but sure. The room faded as she reached him, her voice trembling but clear. You didn't have to do that, she said, glancing at the podium. Not for me. Yes, I did, Ethan replied, his tone soft, resolute. I walked away once. I won't again, not from you. Her lips quivered, and she held up the letter, its edges worn from her grip. I read it. I didn't want to believe you, but I saw Mom today. She told me about your father, about everything. She said you're trying. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. I am. I'll keep trying, Lily, whether you let me in or not. She stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm, a tentative bridge. I'm proud of you, she whispered. For this. The words hit harder than any boardroom victory, a quiet absolution he hadn't dared hope for. He didn't pull her into an embrace, didn't impose, but his eyes softened, a crack in the armor he'd worn too long. Thank you, he said, simple, sincere. The crowd surged around them, reporters shouting, but Ethan tuned it out. Victor's triumph, the board's panic, none of it mattered. He'd surrendered his title, his power, not out of defeat, but to stand for something truer. Lily's touch lingered, a lifeline, and for the first time Ethan felt the weight of his sacrifice lift, replaced by a flicker of warmth, a dignity earned, not bestowed. As they turned to leave side by side, the cold lights of the hall dimmed, behind them. Ethan had lost an empire, but he'd gained a daughter, and in that silent sacrifice, he'd found the man he should have been all along. The small house in Queens stood bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon, its weathered brownstone facade a testament to years of endurance. Ethan Caldwell sat. On the porch steps, his tailored coat swapped for a simple sweater, the silver pen Margaret had given him resting in his pocket. Inside, Lily moved quietly, arranging a tray of tea for her mother, her steps light despite the weight of the past. Weak. Ethan had bought this house days after the shareholders' meeting, his resignation from Caldwell Enterprises still echoing through the financial world. But it wasn't a grand gesture. It was a promise, a place for Margaret to spend her final days in peace, and for Lily to build a future unburdened by debt or scrutiny. The scandal had faded from the headlines, replaced by fresher gossip, but its ripples lingered. Victor Grayson crowed victory in boardroom circles, and the company Ethan had built now bore another's name. He felt no regret. The penthouse in Manhattan sat empty, its cold lights a memory he'd left behind. Here, in this modest corner of the city, he'd found something truer, a dignity not in titles, but in the quiet moments he'd once forsaken. Lily stepped out, balancing the tray, and set it on a small table beside him. "Mom's awake," she said, her voice soft but steady. "She wants to see you." Ethan nodded, rising with a calm he'd earned through surrender. Inside, the living room was warm, its walls lined with photos. Lily as a child, Margaret in brighter days. Margaret lay on the couch, her frail frame propped by pillows, her hazel eyes dim but alive with a spark of recognition. Ethan knelt beside her, his hands clasped, his posture a silent vow of presence. "You look different," she said, her voice a whisper, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Less sharp." He returned the smile, a rare softness breaking through. "I've had some lessons lately," he replied, his tone gentle, steady. She reached for his hand, her grip weak but deliberate. "I saw the news. You gave it all up. For her." Ethan's throat tightened, but he didn't look away. "For both of you," he said. "I should have been here sooner, Margaret. I didn't know. About Charles, about Lily. But that's no excuse. I'm here now." Her eyes glistened, a tear slipping free. "You're here when it counts. That's enough." The words were a balm, soothing a wound he'd carried for decades. He'd failed her once, but this moment was his redemption. Not in grand gestures, but in the quiet strength to stay. Lily joined them, sitting cross-legged on the floor, her presence a bridge between past and present. "I told her about the meeting," she said, glancing at Ethan. "How you just walked away from it all. She didn't believe me at first." Margaret chuckled, a frail sound. "I thought he'd fight to the end. Always did." Ethan shook, his head, his voice low. "I fought the wrong battles too long. This one's worth winning." Lily's lips curved, a tentative warmth in her eyes. "You're stubborn," she said, "but I get it now. Mom said you're trying to be a father. I think you're doing okay." The praise, simple and unadorned, hit harder than any boardroom applause. Ethan didn't reply, just nodded, letting it settle. They sat in companionable silence, the tea cooling as sunlight slanted through the window, casting golden patches on the floor. Margaret's breathing grew slower, her hand still in his, and Ethan felt the fragility of time. "I'm proud of you both," she murmured, her voice fading. "Lily for her heart, you for finding yours." Her eyes closed, a peaceful sigh escaping, and moments later, she was gone. Ethan didn't move, didn't speak. Lily's hand found his shoulder, her touch trembling but firm, and they mourned together, not with sobs, but with the quiet dignity Margaret had lived by. Later, after the doctor came and went, Ethan stepped outside, Lily beside him. The air was crisp, the sky streaked with dusk, and they walked to the tiny backyard, a patch of earth Margaret had loved. "She wanted flowers here," Lily said, her voice thick but steady. "Daisies, like the ones I used to pick." Ethan knelt, pulling a small trowel from a bag he'd brought. "Then we'll plant them," he said, his hand steady as he broke the soil. They worked side by side, the rhythm of digging and planting a silent tribute. Ethan handed Lily a daisy bulb, their fingers brushing, and she smiled, a real one, unguarded. "Mom said you were strong," she said, pressing the bulb into the earth. "She was right, but not how she thought. You're softer than you look." Ethan paused, the silver pen heavy in his pocket, and met her gaze. "She taught me that," he said. "You both did. I spent too long chasing the wrong things. Power, control. I'm learning to let go." Lily nodded, her eyes glistening but clear. "I'm glad you're here," she said, simple, sincere. "Not as the big shot, just you." Ethan's chest warmed, a quiet triumph he hadn't sought but cherished. They finished planting, the row of daisies a promise of spring, and stood back, the earth cool beneath their feet. "She'd like this," Lily said, and Ethan agreed, his voice a whisper. She would. Days later, Ethan moved into a smaller apartment nearby, not a penthouse, but a home. Lily kept the house, her anchor as she rebuilt her life, and they met often. Coffee, dinners, moments of shared silence. Caldwell Enterprises thrived without him, but Ethan found his worth elsewhere, in the daisies blooming, in Lily's growing trust, in the man he'd become. The cold lights of his past had dimmed, replaced by a warmth he'd earned, not through wealth or titles, but through the strength to face his failures and the dignity to repair them. Standing on his balcony one evening, the city a distant hum, Ethan pulled the silver pen from his pocket. He traced its scratches, Margaret's gift a tether to the life he'd reclaimed. He wasn't the titan anymore, but he was a father, a man of honor at last. And in that quiet victory, the shadows parted, letting light shine through. And so, under the quiet glow of a new beginning he stood, not as the titan he once was, but as a man reborn through the courage to face his past. The empire he'd built crumbled into memory, but in its place grew something far greater. A bond forged in sacrifice, a legacy of love reclaimed from the ashes of regret. The cold lights faded, and in their stead, a simple truth shone bright. Honor isn't found in power, but in the strength to mend what was broken. Thank you for joining this journey. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Until next time, may you find your own light through the shadows.